April wind crawled through the Bavarian valley like something wounded, pushing dust along the empty road that led into the village of Idenhof. It was the kind of wind that carried memories. Bomb smoke, distant artillery, the shouts of soldiers who no longer lived, and every person who still remained in the village felt it pressing against their skin like a warning they had learned to obey. Most of the men were gone. Some were bones in Russia, some missing on the Western Front, some simply swallowed by silence. What remained were the old, the ill, and the women who had learned to endure hunger without complaint. Among them stood Marta, 30 years old but aged by war into someone who looked closer to 40. She clutched a frayed shawl around her shoulders as she watched the road from the doorway of the family farmhouse. Her younger sister, Lise, hovered just behind her, 19 and jittery, eyes red from the morning's small argument about whether they should try to hide if Americans arrived. Lise's instinct was to flee. Marta's was to stay. Neither choice felt safe. They had heard too many stories from refugees dragging themselves south, stories of brutality, of humiliation, of what happened when American soldiers reached a village without men to defend it. The few neighbors still in Idenhof lingered near their windows or gathered in hushed knots in their gardens, whispering the same questions over and over. Would the Americans pass through peacefully? Would fighting follow them? Would they punish civilians for the crimes of an empire collapsing around them? The official radio had urged heroic resistance, but even the most loyal villagers recognized propaganda when it tasted like desperation. And the rumors were worse. Rumors trusted fear more than logic. Rumors were the last authority left. So when the distant drone of engines rolled across the hills shortly after noon, the village seemed to inhale all at once. Marta's fingers stiffened around the wooden doorframe. Lise covered her mouth. An old man limped out with a cane, squinting down the road. 2 children darted behind a fence. The sound grew louder, low, steady, unhurried. Whoever was coming did not expect resistance. That truth alone frightened everyone even more. The first jeep appeared around the bend, covered in dust and driven by a soldier with his helmet pushed back slightly, as if boredom had softened his posture. Behind him came another jeep, then a third, then a military truck painted with the white star the villagers now recognized as the symbol of their conquerors. It took only seconds for reality to overwhelm imagination, and in that moment the village's simmering terror finally broke the surface. A scream tore loose from somewhere to the right of Marta's house, sharp, high, raw. Another woman screamed in response, then another. The sound spread like fire, leaping across yards and walls, echoing off the stone church at the center of the village until it became a single collective cry that even the soldiers could not misinterpret. The Americans hit their brakes instinctively. The first jeep swerved slightly before settling. A few rifles lifted, not aggressively but reflexively, and then lowered again when the soldiers saw there was no ambush waiting for them, just terrified civilians expecting something awful. Marta's scream caught in her throat, but Lise's did not. Her younger sister's voice rose with all the panic she had tried to hide for months, her hands shaking as she stepped backward into the farmhouse. Marta grabbed her arm before she could disappear inside. She whispered, "Stay. If we run, they think we hide something." Even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it. She was acting on instinct, on a stubbornness she had inherited from her father, on a desperate need to appear calm even when her pulse hammered in her neck like a fist. The lead jeep did not advance. The driver kept both hands visible, palms resting lightly on the steering wheel as his eyes swept across the street. A young soldier in the passenger seat lifted his helmet slightly and said something to the others in the column, a short phrase Marta couldn't hear but recognized by tone alone as surprise. The Americans exchanged glances, confused, hesitant, almost apologetic. They had expected hostility, possibly a hidden rifleman in the attic of a farmhouse, but they clearly had not expected a village of starving women to explode into fear at the very sight of them. One of the soldiers slowly stepped out. Marta noticed he couldn't have been more than 22, broad-shouldered but soft-faced, the kind of man who might have worked in a shop or played baseball somewhere far across the ocean before the world tore itself apart. He raised both hands, palms outward, in a gesture that looked more like surrender than conquest. His voice carried across the road, steady but cautious. "It's okay," he said, though most of the villagers could not understand English. Tone was enough. His tone said, "We're not here to hurt you." Yet the women didn't move. Lise trembled beside her sister. Another villager sobbed loudly. Someone muttered a prayer. A younger child hiccuped in terror. The emotional weight of years of propaganda, posters portraying Americans as monsters, warnings on the radio repeating that dishonor awaited every captured woman, pressed down on the village like burial soil. Fear was not something that vanished with a single gesture of open hands. Fear had roots. The soldiers seemed to grasp this without needing words. No one rushed forward. No one barked orders. They stepped out slowly, each movement deliberate, almost ceremonious, as if approaching wounded animals who might bolt if startled. A medic climbed down from one of the trucks carrying a small Red Cross bag. Another soldier retrieved a pair of blankets from the back seat. A third moved to the side of the road and knelt to inspect something near a drainage ditch, either a potential mine or a piece of twisted metal left behind by retreating German troop. Everything they did signaled purpose, not threat. Marta's breathing steadied, though her heart remained taut. She studied the Americans with the wary precision of someone who knew her survival depended on correct interpretation. These men looked exhausted, dust on their cheeks, uniforms creased, boots worn. They carried danger, but not the kind of danger she had been warned about. Their posture said discipline. Their eyes said caution. Their hands said restraint. It was the restraint that confused her most. If they wanted to harm the village, they would have surged forward. Instead, they acted as though every inch they moved needed permission. One soldier approached the old man with the cane. He didn't touch him, just gestured toward the cane, then toward the ground, asking without speaking whether he needed help sitting. The old man blinked, startled, and shook his head. A fragile exchange, but an exchange nonetheless. Conversations sometimes begin with gestures instead of words. Something loosened in Marta's chest. Only slightly. Only enough for breath to come easier. But even the smallest easing felt like treason against the fear she had been taught to obey. She kept her hand on Lisa's arm, grounding them both as they watched the Americans spread out to secure the village. Then one of the soldiers discovered something in the road, an abandoned rifle left behind by a fleeing Folksturm boy. He lifted it carefully and held it out for his sergeant to inspect. The sergeant simply nodded and set it aside in the truck. No retribution, no shouting, no accusation, just business. And in that ordinary, almost anticlimactic gesture, the women felt the first crack appear in the nightmare they had been forced to believe. The screams had stopped. The village was quiet now, but it was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of disbelief. A silence held together by the fragile question trembling in every heart. If the danger we feared isn't real, then what else have we been wrong about? The silence that followed the screams felt heavier than the noise itself, as if the entire village was trapped inside a held breath. Marta stood with her hand still wrapped around Lisa's wrist, both sisters watching the Americans fan out with quiet, deliberate care. Dust drifted lazily in the air, catching the sunlight in faint golden threads that made everything look deceptively peaceful, as though the war had never scorched this valley or emptied so many homes. Yet beneath that stillness pulsed a fear that had been carved into them for years, a fear stubborn enough to outlive logic. It clung to Marta like the chilly wind sliding across her skin. She waited for the moment when reality would finally match the horrors they had been promised, but the moment did not come. The soldiers kept their distance, their movements measured, respectful even, and somehow that unsettled her more. The young medic who had first stepped out approached slowly, carrying his bag at his side, not in front of him. He did not close the gap between himself and the villagers. He simply let them see that he meant no harm. Marta found herself studying his face. The gentle uncertainty in his eyes, the weariness around his mouth, the faint scrape of beard that suggested nights spent waking to mortar fire rather than sleep. He raised a hand only halfway, as though afraid to scare them further. His patience felt almost unnatural in a time when everything else had been marked by urgency, force, or blind chaos. Lise lowered her hands from her ears, and the tremble in her breathing eased, but she remained pressed against her sister's side. Marta felt the shift, subtle but undeniable. Something was changing, and it was terrifying in its own way. Nearby, Frau Adler, a widow with iron-gray hair and a reputation for stubborn faith in the fatherland, peeked out from her doorway. Her lips were pressed tight, trembling with the effort to maintain composure. She had been the loudest voice insisting that American soldiers would bring ruin to every woman here. She had repeated the warnings broadcast over the radio, the tales whispered by passing refugees. She had kept the fear alive long after others had grown too exhausted to feed it. Yet even she appeared startled by the calmness of the men now pacing the village road. One soldier paused near her fence to set down a crate of rations. He didn't look toward her or speak, just placed it gently on the ground as though delivering a parcel rather than claiming territory. The simplicity of the gesture made her jaw slacken, loosening beliefs she had held like armor. The Americans moved with a clear rhythm, two checking the barns, one collecting abandoned weapons, another sketching notes on a clipboard with an almost bureaucratic focus. It became obvious that their mission here was methodical rather than vengeful. Their priority was structure, not dominance. The air of menace the villagers had expected simply did not materialize. Marta watched as a soldier kneeled to inspect a broken wagon wheel, his fingers brushing away dirt like a craftsman assessing repairs. She wondered how a man who handled war machines all day could still move with such gentleness. Something about it contradicted everything she'd been told. She realized, with a rising unease, that she did not know what to believe anymore. The stories had always been clear. Americans were brutes, corruptors, violators. They drank, they laughed, they pillaged. They disrespected German womanhood, German land, German dignity. Everyone knew the lines by heart. The propaganda had been relentless, repeated on posters and whispered by officers with grim expressions meant to signal the seriousness of the threat. But the soldiers in front of her looked more like tired young men wishing for a bed and a meal than the monsters she had pictured. One of them unwrapped a chocolate bar and tossed a piece to a boy who had dared to peek from behind a rain barrel. The boy flinched but caught it clumsily and scurried back behind the barrel, staring at the chocolate as if it were a live grenade. Marta felt something tug inside her. Pity, maybe, or the uncomfortable recognition that we fear what we do not understand. Lise whispered, "They aren't doing anything." Her voice carried awe, but also confusion. She had braced herself for violence the moment the jeeps appeared. Instead, she saw a soldier help another adjust a heavy radio on his back. She saw them share water from a canteen. She saw one of them look toward the fields with a wistful expression, as though remembering home. The contrast between expectation and reality was so sharp it hurt. For the first time since the engines had echoed down the road, Lise took a step forward. Not much, just the length of her foot, but enough for Marta to feel the shift. Fear was receding. Not disappearing, but retreating into the corners of the mind where doubt had begun to grow. Even Frau Adler emerged fully from her doorway now, cautiously approaching the crate left at her fence. With a shaky hand she lifted the lid and found tins of meat, biscuits, powdered milk. The kind of food she hadn't seen in months. Her eyes darted from the supplies to the soldier who had carried them. He gave no sign of triumph or condescension. He simply continued his work, scanning rooftops for potential threats. Her expression softened, just barely. If propaganda had shaped her fear, reality was now chiseling away at it with quiet persistence. The medic finally spoke again, his voice calm, low, almost apologetic. He gestured toward the old man with the cane, offering assistance without pressure. The old man hesitated, glancing toward Marta as if asking permission. She nodded faintly. The medic approached him slowly, checked his pulse, then his breathing, then touched the swollen ankle that had long troubled him. His touch was gentle enough to make the old man exhale in surprise. That exhale rippled through the watching villagers like wind disturbing still water. Fear cracked again, this time wider. Marta understood that this moment, this precise, fragile moment, was the true beginning of something. Trust was too ambitious a word, but possibility hovered just close enough to touch. She felt her beliefs shifting like ice thawing beneath spring sunlight. She still did not know what these soldiers wanted, or what tomorrow would bring, but she knew the certainty she once clung to was fading fast. The Americans were not angels. They were not devils. They were simply men, and that truth alone unraveled years of warnings that had painted them as inhuman threats. Marta felt the weight of that contradiction sink into her chest. It was freeing and frightening at once. The village was still occupied. Their fate was still uncertain. But the fear that had shaped every thought now quivered under the pressure of evidence. And then, just as Marta felt her pulse steady, a shout rose from the edge of the village. Sharp, urgent, unmistakably alarmed. The soldiers snapped to attention. The villagers froze. Something unexpected had been found near the tree line, something that made the medic drop his bag and run. For a single suspended heartbeat, the fragile progress in Idenhof hung in the balance, and Marta felt the old fear surge back, colder than before. The shout that shattered the fragile calm came from the tree line just beyond the last farmhouse, a sharp, urgent call that transformed the Americans instantly. Rifles lifted, boots thundered across the packed earth, and the quiet rhythm of inspection became a swift, coordinated surge toward potential danger. Marta felt her pulse jolt, and Lise instinctively stepped behind her again, the progress of the last hour collapsing beneath the weight of old fears. The villagers had begun to believe the Americans were simply tired men doing their duty, but the sudden alarm reminded them that war had not quite released its grip on this valley. Something had been discovered, something serious enough to change the soldiers' posture from careful patience to hardened focus. Marta strained to see past the farmhouse roofs as the medic and two infantrymen sprinted toward the noise. Dust swirled behind them, blurring their shapes like ghosts moving through sunlight. A strange mix of dread and curiosity tightened in Marta's stomach. Every villager knew the woods hid the remnants of the war. Deserters, abandoned equipment, perhaps even boys from the Volkssturm who had fled instead of defending the village. Yet the Americans had not seemed truly alarmed until now. Lise whispered a question, but Marta couldn't answer. Her thoughts were tangled in the uneasy hope that whatever the soldiers found would not pull them back into violence. More troops followed, forming a perimeter as they approached the trees. Their movements were efficient, almost ritualistic. Marta realized she was witnessing the instinct of men who had lived for months in uncertainty, always expecting an enemy behind the next branch or doorway. And though the sight of their tension frightened her, she also felt an unexpected flicker of empathy. This war had scarred them too. Frau Adler emerged from her yard, gripping her shawl tightly. "What is happening?" she asked, her voice cracking under the strain of suppressed panic. No one answered her. The villagers were frozen, watching the Americans converge around something half-hidden in the brush. Then the medic knelt, blocking their view. Someone else shouted instructions. A rifle was raised, not aimed, but ready. Minutes crawled by, each one stretching thin as wire. Then one soldier straightened and signaled for others to approach more slowly. The medic stood as well, wiping his hands on his trousers and glancing back toward the village. His expression caught between relief and a different kind of concern. At last the Americans emerged carrying a figure between them, a young man barely older than Lise, his uniform torn to shreds, his body limp, his face streaked with dirt and dried blood. He was no American. He was German. And he was barely alive. A wave of breath swept through the villagers. Some recoiled. Others murmured prayers or curses. Marta felt her heart twist. She did not recognize the young man immediately, but the sight of him, half-starved, shaking, his leg crudely bandaged with a strip of curtain fabric, told a story more terrible than any rumor. This was not a proud defender of the fatherland. This was a runaway, a boy forced into uniform, abandoned in the woods like discarded debris. The Americans set him down gently near the well, and the medic immediately began treating him, pulling out tools with a steady hand. The soldiers around him relaxed only slightly, keeping watch for any sign the boy had not been alone. But the tension in their shoulders said they believed the worst danger had passed. Marta stepped closer, the weight of the moment drawing her forward despite her fear. Lise followed at her side, her breaths quick and shallow. The medic gestured to Marta, pointing at a bucket hanging beside the well. It took her a second to understand he wanted water. When she approached, he stepped aside politely, creating space for her to lower the bucket. The act was small, but it struck her with unexpected force. A soldier of the conquering army was asking, quietly, without demand, for her help. She handed him the bucket, and he dipped a cloth into the water before pressing it to the boy's cracked lip. The young German stirred, eyes fluttering open. For a moment he looked terrified, as though waking into a nightmare, but the medic murmured something soft, reassuring. The tone transcended language. The boy's breathing steadied. A whisper rippled through the villagers. "Is he one of ours? He looks familiar. He might be from the Muller farm." Speculation blended with shame. The boy was a reminder of everything the war had taken. Sons, brothers, innocence. And now, the first real act of mercy they had witnessed came not from their own countrymen but from the Americans they had feared. Frau Adler stepped forward, her eyes shining with something between grief and revelation. She recognized the boy first. "His name is Emil," she said quietly. "He was taken in February. He never wanted to go." Her voice wavered. The entire village knew what the Volkssturm had become in the war's final months, a desperate net cast over anyone too young or too old to resist. Emil had been both terrified and unwilling. And now he lay here, alive only because the soldiers he had been taught to fear had found him before hunger or infection could finish the job. Marta watched the medic work, and something fundamental shifted inside her. The fear she had carried for days, months, years, it didn't vanish, but it no longer controlled her. The Americans were still occupiers, still armed, still unpredictable. But the image of a foreign soldier tending to a dying German boy created a crack that no amount of propaganda could seal again. She glanced at Lise. Her sister's eyes were wide, reflecting a dawning truth neither of them could turn away from. Reality had arrived, and it was far more complicated, far more human, than they had ever been told. As the medic wrapped a fresh bandage around Emil's leg, one of the American sergeants approached, scanning the quiet fields with suspicion. He spoke to his men in a low voice, too soft for the villagers to understand. But Marta recognized the tone. The danger wasn't over. Something else was out there, something the Americans had not yet found. The sergeant's gaze swept toward the woods again, sharp and wary, as though the trees themselves held a secret waiting to break free. Night arrived quietly over Idenhof, slipping across the rooftops like a dark cloth pulled over a weary body. Lamps flickered behind shuttered windows, offering soft golden squares against the deepening blue. For the first time in weeks, the village felt still, not peaceful, not yet, but suspended in a fragile calm that might shatter if anyone breathed too sharply. Marta stood near the well where Emile now rested on a makeshift cot, her shawl pulled tight, her thoughts drifting in uneasy spirals. The Americans had worked through the afternoon securing the perimeter, tending to the wounded boy, and setting up a small camp at the edge of the wheat field. Their discipline had become a strange comfort, as though order itself had returned after months of chaos. The villagers hovered near their homes, drawn together by fear yet cautiously watching the foreigners whose actions contradicted every rumor they had once clung to. Lise stood beside Marta, unusually quiet, her eyes reflecting the lantern glow like distant stars. She had spent the evening helping gather clean cloth and water for Emile, her nervousness replaced by a gentleness Marta had almost forgotten she possessed. The boy slept now, breathing slowly, his body no longer trembling. The medic had promised he would survive if infection stayed away. That simple promise felt like an impossible luxury in a world where promises had died long before soldiers arrived. When the Americans lit their camp lanterns, the soft orbs of light cast a warm halo over their tents. The soldiers moved calmly, eating from tin mess kits, speaking in low tones, occasionally laughing in a muted way that suggested exhaustion more than joy. Their laughter sounded like something remembered from another life, not celebrated in this one. Marta watched them with careful eyes, trying to translate gestures rather than words. She saw fatigue, relief, wariness, and something unexpected, respect. Not affection, not friendliness, but a quiet respect that softened the edges of fear. Frau Adler shuffled toward the well, her hands wrapped around a small basket. Marta recognized the offering even before she spoke. "I boiled these," the widow said, voice thick with uncertainty. Inside were several small potatoes, shriveled but edible. An apology in the form of food. A peace offering carved from the last of her garden. Marta felt a stirring in her chest. She gently helped the widow set the basket near the cot, then placed a hand on her shoulder. The gesture surprised both of them. Across the yard, the medic approached, wiping his hands on a towel. He nodded respectfully at the widow, then knelt beside Emile again, checking his pulse before covering him with another blanket. Frau Adler watched him, her stern face softening into something almost maternal. "He could have died alone," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Marta heard the tremor of truth beneath the words. The medic glanced up, offering a tired smile, and in that moment the distance between conqueror and conquered narrowed to a thread. As the night deepened, the younger American soldiers drifted into quiet circles, sharing cigarettes, mending gear, humming snatches of unfamiliar tunes. Their voices rose and fell like low waves against a dark shore. Marta found herself listening with unexpected comfort. These voices did not carry the harsh cadence of commands or threats. They sounded human, brittle, mortal. It unsettled her to realize how easily fear could blind one to the humanity of others. Lise leaned against her, whispering, "They seem so normal." Marta nodded, unable to summon a reply that captured the complexity growing inside her. A breeze rustled the wheat field beyond the American camp, bending the tall stalks into graceful arcs that shimmered in the lantern light. The sergeant who had led the search earlier stood watch there, boots planted firmly, silhouette sharp against the sky. His presence reminded everyone that the danger had not fully vanished. The woods still whispered of secrets, the war still breathed in the soil. But the sergeant's vigilance brought a strange reassurance. His caution was not aimed at the villagers. He was their shield tonight, not their threat. Marta approached the medic as he finished checking Emile once more. "He will live?" she asked softly. He understood the question even through her accent. "Yes," he answered with calm certainty. "He's strong." The simplicity of the reply struck her like a stone skipping across still water. Strength had been twisted into something harsh during the war, measured in cruelty, sacrifice, blind loyalty. But here, in the lamp-lit quiet, strength looked like survival, compassion, patience. It looked like a young soldier tending to a boy who might have been forced to kill him under different circumstances. The medic hesitated before adding, "Tomorrow we move him to a safer place." Marta nodded, though worry pinched her brow. She did not know what safer meant anymore. Yet the medic's sincerity soothed some of the uncertainty. Lise stepped forward and offered him a folded cloth she had embroidered years ago. The soldier accepted it gently, as though receiving something sacred. Marta felt something warm stir inside her, small, delicate, but unmistakably hope. As the village settled into an uneasy rest, shadows stretched across the fields, merging with the forest edge. The Americans' lanterns dimmed as one by one the soldiers prepared for sleep. Only the sergeant remained fully awake, scanning the quiet horizon. Marta lingered near the well, unwilling to step inside just yet. The night felt different, less like an enemy, more like a witness. Lise rested her head on her sister's shoulder, whispering, "Maybe tomorrow will be better." Her voice trembled with longing rather than fear. Then the sergeant stiffened. Marta saw it instantly. The way his hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, the way his eyes narrowed at a flicker of movement near the trees. The breeze shifted, carrying a faint rustle that did not belong to wind. The calm of the night tightened, stretched, thinned. Marta's breath caught in her throat. Something, or someone, was moving in the woods again. That's it for today's story.